A very warm welcome to all of you. So in today's class, I want to begin from where we left off in the previous class, right? So in the previous lecture, we covered Stephen Castle's paper in which Castles argues that migration needs to be seen as a part of broader processes of social change and development. So in other words, what Castles is saying is that you cannot disentangle migration from development. So there's a whole body of literature in migration studies, largely known as the migration and development discourse or the migration and development literature. And now in this migration and development narrative or discourse, which is also known as the mainstream migration and development literature, you can see that this is somewhat different from what Castles is arguing. Over here, migration and development are two distinct analytical categories, and this literature is largely focused on studying the impacts of migration on development. So you can see very well how this is analytically very different from what Castles was arguing, and Stephen Castles, even Hein-de Haas and many other scholars argue that migration cannot and should not be separated from processes of development. It is a part and parcel of broader processes of development. Now, however, in the migration and development paradigm that we are going to discuss today, migration and development are treated as two distinct categories, as variables in many empirical projects, and then researchers, mostly economists, go on to study the relationship between the two. So, what is the impact of migration on development? Or what is the impact of development on migration? So then conceptually and analytically in the migration and development discourse, there's an idea, or we can say there's a very strong assumption that migration and development are mutually exclusive, and it is possible to examine the relationship, even the causality of one on the other. So again, before we start, I want to emphasize how looking at migration and development this way in the mainstream migration and development discourse is fundamentally different from the social transformation approach that we discussed in the previous lecture. Now, having said that, let me take you through the main areas that I will cover in this two-part lecture on migration and development. Right. So, in this lecture, we will first cover the mainstream migration and development discourse, which predominantly focuses on migration and remittances. Now, this is a simplistic literature that mostly examines the impact of remittances on individuals without much touching upon the context of migration, the power relations in migration, its inequality, the politics, etc. So, we're going to briefly look at this mainstream migration and development discourse. We will then move on to the paradoxes of migration and development highlighted by Hein-de Haas. So, Hein-de Haas follows Stephen Castles and he argues why and how migration should be an intrinsic part of broader processes of development and social change, instead of the antithesis of development as dominant discourses hold. Now, like Castles, Hein-de Haas says that when societies go through various economic, cultural, technological, political, demographic transitions associated with development, this leads to an increasing level of both internal migration and international migration. So, this work is also somewhat anchored in the transitional theories of migration that we have discussed. And then Hein-de Haas goes on to argue that low-income societies generally have lower immigration levels because poverty tends to constrain people's movement. And then development leads to more instead of less migration. Now, why is that? Because development increases people's capabilities to move, it increases people's capacities to move, their aspirations, their desires to move. So, the paradox of development-driven immigration is that with increasing development, you have more and not less migration. Now, what Hein-de Haas also argues is that this paradox of development-driven immigration hikes shows the inability of conventional push-pull models, neoclassical models to explain migration, like we saw in the previous week, And then we need to understand migration in different ways. If push-pull is unable to explain increases in migration with development, if neoclassical theories are unable to explain increases in migration with development, then clearly there's something missing here. And this is where Hinde-Haas and Castles and many others refer to the need for a new vision of migration as part of broader development. So not to see migration and development separately, but to look at migration as part of broader development processes. And then migration really, I mean, there's no doubt that migration is shaped by development in both origin societies and destination societies, and that migration contributes to change in its own right. But however, the embeddedness of migration in broader processes of social transformation and development also then means that migration's own potential to affect structural change is fundamentally limited. And so therefore, Hinde-Haas argues that this shows the logical policy of narratives that cast development as a solution for perceived migration problems, or narratives that cast migration and remittances as solutions or panaceas with which to solve fundamental development problems. So we'll spend some time doing the paradoxes of migration as enunciated by Hinde-Haas, and then we'll move on to the migration development nexus. Again, this is work done by Giger and Piku in a 2013 paper, which was actually an introduction to a special issue which looked at the migration and development nexus more critically. Again, more critical of the mainstream migration and development paradigm. And then we're going to look at critical development studies. Very briefly, we will look at the critical development studies perspective by Latin American scholars Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues, who largely locate certain kinds of migration within the context of global inequality and capitalism. This is also a critique of the mainstream migration and development discourse. So that is the outline of this class that we will follow in 2 lectures. Right. So let us now come to the mainstream migration and development discourse. What is the mainstream migration and development discourse? What do we understand by it? So very simply put, the mainstream migration and development discourse is also known as a win-win-win or triple win. The idea is that migration is beneficial for destination regions where migrants are going, mostly as workers. Migration is beneficial for source regions where migrants come from, and of course, migration is beneficial for migrants themselves and in turn their families. Right. So why is migration beneficial for destination regions? So typically when migrant workers go to destination regions, they are offering their labor. There is labor scarcity in these destinations. So migrants offer their productive resources and they contribute to the development process in destination regions. They contribute to production, they contribute to employment, and in turn they contribute to the economies and societies of the destination regions. Now what about source regions? According to the mainstream migration and development discourse, migration is mediated by remittances. So when migrants go, they send remittances back, and source regions benefit from these remittances. And similarly, of course, when migrants are going, they earn an income, they earn an income and they benefit from this income. Themselves and their families benefit from the incomes that migrants earn in destination regions. So therefore, this is also something that is a win. Right. So remember, we're talking about circular migration here. You can see embedded in this discourse is the understanding that migration is circular. Migrants work at their destination for short durations, for long durations, but eventually they return to their home countries in the context of international migration, or they return to their source regions, the source villages or the towns where they come from in the context of internal migration, right? And then as we go along in this course, we will also study circular migration in more detail. When migrants return back to the source region. So we have a couple of guest lectures on the political economy of circular migration, on the empirics of circular migration, on policies related to circular migration. But for now, we sort of look at this discourse where remittances are at the forefront of the migration and development discourse. And clearly, at the turn of the 21st century, it appeared that remittances were the new development mantra. So, Devesh Kapoor in a paper wrote that at that point, official development assistance, or what is known as aid, aid is very important, is considered to be very important for developing countries, but it turns out that at the turn of the century, the remittances by international migrants actually were more in US dollar terms compared to the foreign assistance that was sent by developed countries, right? So therefore, this whole perspective of migration being a triple win and remittances being a new development mantra kind of gained ground. But as we know that this is a very linear discourse, and this discourse is dominated by the positive impacts of migration, the positive impacts of remittances on individual and household outcomes. And and this discourse then, therefore, by nature of being so focused on individuals and at most their families, it ends up evading structural questions of asymmetries in power between source and destination regions, of inequality between source and destination region. And this is therefore relevant for both international and internal migration. Though the literature largely focuses on international migration in the context of the migration and development discourse, it's equally relevant for internal migration, as we will see in the context of circular migration in this course. Now, another thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that this arrangement, right, this arrangement of circular migration is increasingly desired by most developed countries, right? Why is it desired by most developed countries? Because they have labor shortages and they need labor migrants, but they don't want them to permanently settle down in destination regions. So they have policies of circular migration, and they emphasize on the benefits of remittances to source regions, to developing countries where families of migrants stay, and they emphasize that eventually migrants should leave. So therefore, this is an arrangement, like I mentioned, is being increasingly desired by developed countries who dominate this discourse. And so in the name of migration management or migration control, this whole mainstream development discourse of migration and development is being institutionalized. And having said that, like we saw earlier, that this discourse then really evades certain fundamental structural questions to which we will come in a little while. Okay, so now we come to the paradoxes of migration and development, a paper by Hein de Haas. And as I mentioned earlier, Hein de Haas, like Stephen Castles, argues that migration is an intrinsic part of broader processes of development and social change. However, the political discourse, the media, various researchers, they continue to represent migration implicitly or explicitly as the antithesis of development. And this is a very strong state discourse as well, right? And now this is evident in many policy proposals to use aid, trade, and remittance as fast-track means to accelerate development in origin countries in order to remove the need to emigrate. And you can think of a similar thing happening in the context of internal migration as well, where migration is essentially perceived as a bad thing that needs to be stopped. Now, the idea that migration is bad is grounded in this idea that poverty, violence, and other forms of human misery are the main causes of migration. And so therefore, development is presented as a solution to perceived migration problems. And however, Hein de Haas argues that this ignores the evidence, this ignores the mounting empirical evidence that development first tends to increase migration both internal and international migration. And there is also a body of literature that shows that the poorest are least likely to migrate. Populations which are the most vulnerable to violence, oppression, economic shocks, environmental stress, that are involuntary, immobile. And so those who are unable to move to save their lives or build new and possibly better lives elsewhere. And when development happens, it typically leads to increasing levels of migration, because what it's doing is it's simultaneously endowing people with the capabilities to move as well as the aspirations to move, and increasing levels of education, access to modern media, exposure to relative wealth of migrants. All of these then coincide with changing ideas of what's a good life. And a good life is seen as something which is away from agrarian or pastoral lifestyles, and it is associated with increasing material aspirations. So rising education levels also tend to increase mobility, because people are more likely to have to move in order to obtain degrees or finish secondary school or find jobs that match their qualifications in labor markets that grow in structural complexity. So Hindhaus argues that while farm workers or construction workers are likely to find employment in close geographical proximity to where they live, the more specialized your work is, it's likely that you have to move more to find suitable, appropriate work. Now, such factors help to explain the paradox of economic and human development in low-income countries, in low-income societies that typically accelerate emigration, right? And only when countries achieve a high income status and rural to urban transitions have largely been completed, which means countries have largely become urbanized, do emigration levels tend to go down. So the point is, what Hindhaus is arguing is that the relationship between migration and development is not linear. It actually takes the shape of an inverted U curve, which we will come to in the next slide. Right. So what you have here is a non-linear inverted U-shaped relationship between development and emigration. So let us go through this graph. So you can see on the x-axis you have development, and on the y-axis you have migration. And in migration you have emigration, which is essentially out-migration, people moving out of a country. And you have immigration, which is in-migration, which is people moving in a country. So you can see in the graph that as a country develops, emigration actually increases first. And it's only after a certain level of development does emigration or out-migration from the country declines. Similarly, you look at immigration, which is people coming in, moving into this country. Obviously, if levels of development are low, it's very clear that immigration levels are low. As countries develop, then in-migrants also, the rate of in-migration also tends to increase. Immigration tends to increase. So you see increasing migration with development, while it's largely intuitive, it's also a paradox. It's an inconvenient truth for policymakers, for bureaucrats who argue that development somehow can reduce emigration. That's not true. Development actually increases emigration, right? And so the idea that development can be a medicine against migration is something which is just completely not empirically valid, is what Hindhaus says. And that's really one of the paradoxes of development. And we're going to come to this in a little more detail in a bit. Right. So, Hindhaus argues that the popular idea that much of south to north migration is essentially driven by poverty, warfare, environmental degradation, and in recent years even climate change is not really empirically valid as such. And the idea that migrants constitute a growing mass of destitute victims desperate to leave, it ignores the growing evidence that most long-distance migration occurs neither from the poorest countries nor from the poorest segments of the population. In fact, what we know empirically is that middle income countries tend to be the most migratory, and international migrants predominantly come from relatively better off sections of origin population. And that makes sense with this previous graph. Let me take you to it again. You can see with development, you find migration actually increasing, right? So the fact that middle income countries actually have the highest rates of migratory activity is completely empirically valid. And then, so therefore, and what are these middle income countries? So Hindehas argues that middle income countries such as Mexico, Morocco, Turkey, the Philippines, all of these countries from, various geographical parts of the world, they figure prominently among the origin countries of international labor migrants. And the other thing that, he draws our attention to is the fact that there's a lot of talk about African migration, specifically in Europe. And what he argues is that in Africa, for instance, extra-continental migration, mainly towards Europe and also the Gulf and the Americas, is dominated by middle-income countries in both South and North Africa, while migration from the most low-income sub-Saharan countries is lower on average, and it's predominantly intra-regional, within the region. So citizens of sub-Saharan African countries who are migrating to Europe or North America, they tend to be from the relatively well-off and educated groups, as the relatively poor population, as the relatively poor struggle to qualify for visas, and they generally do not have the means to assume the risks and the costs involved in migrating. So now we come to this graph, and what this graph is really showing us is the association between development levels of immigration and emigration, right? So here on the x-axis, you have the Human Development Index, and on the y-axis, you have the percentage of population that migrates, right? So you can see that at very low levels of human development, so the blue bars are for immigrants and the red bars are for immigrants. So at very low levels of human development, both emigration is also low, which means the rate of people migrating outside the country is low, because these are generally poor countries that have a low HDI, people don't have the means to migrate. And in migrants, immigration is also low. Why is that? Because at low levels of HDI, which sort of, go hand in hand with low per capita income, the incentive for others to migrate into such countries is low. So on the net, at the net, you have emigration. These are net emigration countries. So countries with low HDI, you can see have both low emigration and low immigration, but as as logic would explain, they are net emigration countries. More people move out from these countries than people coming into these countries. Now you see, as the Human Development Index of a country increases, countries with low HDIs have a greater share of immigrants compared to immigrants, right? And then once we come to the middle HDI, you can see that, immigrants are the highest. These are typically the countries, these are middle income countries largely, which have a middle HDI. I mean, of course, there'll be variations and so on. But so when in middle income countries where you have the means to move, where you have capabilities and aspirations to move, that's where immigration is also high, right? And then by the time you move high HDI countries, right? High HDI countries are also typically high income countries. Again, there'll be some variations here and there, but by and large, high HDI countries are high immigration countries. You can see in these countries, immigrants are more than emigrants. So because the income levels are high, the quality of life is high, the standard of living is high, more people migrate into these countries than people migrating out of these countries. So you can see there's a very clear association between development and levels of immigration and emigration. You can see the blue, which is emigration, follows the inverted U curve that we saw in the previous graph. So if in countries with low HDI, rates of emigration are low, and then as the HDI increases, emigration also in countries with higher HDI, emigration tends to be higher. But you can see in countries with the highest HDI, emigration tends to be lower. So you can see that this mirrors the inverted U we saw in the previous graph. What about immigrants? There's a clear pattern. In countries with the highest HDI, immigration is the highest, and in countries with the lowest HDI, immigration is the lowest. And you can see there's a clear linear pattern. As the HDI increases, as countries move from very low to middle to high to very high HDI, immigration also increases because these destinations become lucrative for people to move in for higher income, for better quality of life, and so on. So that's the broad, that's the broad relationship, the association between development and levels of immigration and emigration. You can see very well that, there are echoes of the transitional theories that you have studied in a previous class. Of course, these data only provide national averages depending upon specific contexts, but we find considerable variation between countries, and there are also some irregularities that can be detected. Now, for instance, large and populous countries tend to have low emigration levels compared to their population, relative to their population. And this is mainly because in these countries, more migration is contained within their borders. So, for instance, in the case of China, Hinde-Haas gives us the figure in the paper, this paper was published in 2019, that approximately 10 million China-born people live abroad, which is 0.7% of the Chinese population, less than 1% of the Chinese population. Similarly, in India, at the time of this paper, in 2019, which was published in 2019, not so long ago, 16.6 million India-born international migrants were there in the world, and they represented only 1.2% of the total Indian population. So while the absolute numbers might be high, the percentage of out migrants compared to the population is quite low for both large countries like India and China. And by contrast, small states such as Lesotho, Cape Verde, these states that don't have large urban centers, and even many Caribbean nations, they have very high emigration rates. And that's largely because young people don't find work and lifestyle opportunities that match their aspirations in their own countries. Then, very interesting, Hinde-Haas tells us that there are also some countries with much lower emigration than one would expect based on the migration transition theory. So, Thailand, for example, has very low levels of emigration compared to other countries. Similarly, South Korea, Malaysia, these countries have very low rates of emigration for their levels of development. And so the reasons for this are not entirely clear, but Hinde-Haas argues that they're likely to be related to cultural factors and the fact that Thailand has never been colonized and hence has no extensive historical links with any metropolis. And finally, a very important point, immigration levels in industrialized high-income countries vary significantly, and they depend on factors such as labor market structure, immigration policies, as well as cultural factors. While in most high-income countries such as the US, France, and the UK, immigrants constitute about 10 to 15% of the total population, these percentages are much higher in the Arab Gulf states and in small countries or city-states that lack a rural hinterland or that have a high level of global connectedness, reaching nearly 90% in the UAE, 75% in Kuwait, 46% in Singapore, and nearly 30% in Switzerland. In New York City, 38% of the population and 46% workers are foreign born. So you also have the concept of global cities, and in global cities you find that immigration is much, much higher. Now in contrast, the 2.3 million officially registered immigrants in Japan are only about 1.8% of the population. The 1.2 million migrants in South Korea, only about 2.3% of the population. So these high-income countries have relatively quite low levels of immigration. Right. So now let us come to some of the practical implications and the policy paradoxes of migration and development that Hein de Haas highlights in his paper. Now, for instance, if we apply the migration transition theory to sub-Saharan African countries, which are the target of much international aid and development instead of migration programs, it seems safe to assume that from sub-Saharan Africa, migration will actually increase as a consequence of development. And the higher levels of education, income, connectivity, all of these are likely to fuel emigration to increasingly distant lands. So rather than curbing migration, Hein de Haas argues that development in sub-Saharan Africa will enable and inspire more people to move. And in fact, high levels of poverty, illiteracy, and a weak infrastructure have often prevented previous generations of Africans from migrating over longer distances. And it is also no coincidence, Hein de Haas argues, that extra-continental emigration levels have generally been the highest from African countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, as well as South Africa, Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, who have relatively higher levels of economic development and global integration through economic ties and infrastructure. So therefore, in future, as Africa develops, emigration from sub-Saharan Africa is likely to increase as a result of African development. And he gives us the example of many Asian countries. While many Asian countries began to massively participate in global migration from the 1960s, largely reflecting the fast rates of economic development and demographic transitions in those countries, it's likely that Africans will form an increasingly large share of future global migrant population. And this is exactly, this is a paradox of migration development policy, where policy, specifically international policy, largely tries to contain migration through development, whereas migration and development actually go hand in hand. And now this brings me to the last point about de Haas's paper, about the relationship between migration and development being asymmetric. And so the relationship between migration and development, you will see, is reciprocal, but it's strongly asymmetric. And this again, brings us to the beginning of this lecture and the previous lecture, where the conceptualization of migration as an intrinsic part of processes of development and social transformation implies that migration is a sub-process of larger development processes. So if you read the paper, you will find there's a figure in the paper that depicts this, how migration is a sub-process of larger development processes. And de Haas argues that while processes of social transformation drive migration, migration is less likely to fundamentally alter the deeper political and economic structures of origin and destination societies. And of course, there's no doubt that short-term and local impacts of migration can be significant, as the mainstream migration and development literature argues. In the longer term, however, most migrant groups largely adapt to the culture and economic systems of destination countries. So, therefore, the embeddedness of migration in broader development processes also means that its potential to affect structural change is fundamentally limited. And then for policy, this shows the logical policy of two very different narratives. First, that development is a solution for perceived migration problems. And second, that migration and remittances are a panacea with which to solve fundamental development problems. Both of these then don't hold if we accept that migration is only one part of broader development processes. So with this, we come to the end of the first part of the lecture of migration and development. In the next class, we will continue our conversation about the migration and development discourse, looking at the migration and development nexus and also focusing on critical development studies. Thank you very much.